He came down the stairs with a lantern and no particular expectation. The stone steps were 7 in number, worn smooth at their centers by boots that had not belonged to him, and the air that rose to meet him was cool and close and smelled of earth and something cured, something that had been cut and dried and laid in against the long dark of winter with deliberate, patient hands. He paused at the 4th step. The lantern swung forward on its bail, and the light moved across the wall ahead of him like a slow tide coming in. What it found there stopped him. Onions. Row upon row of them, plaited into ropes, and hung from iron pegs driven between the mortared stones, their papery skins the color of old brass, each one swollen to a size that strained comprehension in a county where the summer had been dry and the soil in every other field had gone to powder and crack. Below them, stacked in slatted crates fitted tight against the wall, cabbages with their outer leaves stripped to a blue-green that held the lantern light like lacquer, heads so dense a man could not have dented one with his thumb. And below those, in burlap sacks marked in pencil with 7 different surnames, not one of them hers, late potatoes, each sack tied at the neck and set square on the earthen floor as if arranged for a photograph of plenty. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and did not speak. The ceiling above him was earthen, arched, underpinned by a framework of cedar poles that had been set in place by hands now decades gone. The walls were mortared fieldstone, gray and exact, laid by someone who had understood that a thing built for cold must be built for permanence. 40 feet the cellar ran, from the stair foot to the far wall where a second lantern had already been lit and hung, lit by her, before his arrival, so that he would see everything clearly. He turned the lantern slowly. The light crossed sack after sack, rope after rope, crate after crate. He was a man practiced in the translation of land into figures, of soil and slope and drainage into columns of taxable worth, and he had written this parcel down in the county record with a phrase as final as a door closing: unimprovable swamp. He had written it in 1889, and again in the spring of 1890, when the parcel went to tax sale, and no one in the township had disagreed with him. The lantern reached the far wall. He turned back toward the stairs. She was standing at the top of them, one hand resting on the doorframe, watching him with the expression of a woman who had long since stopped needing to say anything aloud. He had no instrument for measuring what surrounded him. His ledger was upstairs. But to understand what filled this cellar, and what it cost to fill it, we must go back past 3 harvests, past the cellar itself, past the first turned spade of black ground, to the spring of 1890, and $30, and 12 acres of mud. The spring of 1890 came late to Gage County, as it often did, arriving not with warmth but with a cold and patient wetness that settled into the low ground and stayed. The creek bottoms along the Little Sandy held their water weeks after the upland fields had dried to workable tilth, and the 12 acres at the bend below the old German claim held it longest of all. By the end of April, when a man stood at the fence line and looked down into that parcel, he saw not ground but a mirror, a flat and sullen shine of standing water broken only by the gray crowns of willow and the dark feathering of smartweed standing in the flood like something that had given up waiting to be rescued. The county had carried the parcel on its delinquent roll for 2 years running. The family that had last held the deed had let it go quietly, the way men let go of things they cannot explain to their neighbors without shame. The taxes owed amounted to $22. The county set the opening bid at $30. No one was expected to meet it. The room where the tax sale was held was a narrow one above the dry goods store on the main street of Beatrice, a room that smelled of pipe smoke and damp wool, and the particular staleness of documents handled too many times. There were perhaps a dozen men present, farmers mostly, some with their hats in their hands, come to watch or to bid on one of the 3 other parcels offered that morning. The other 3 parcels went quickly. Then the clerk read the description of the 12 acres at the creek bend: swamp ground, willow-choked, flooded at the time of assessment, and there was a pause in the room that was not quite silence but was close to it. She stepped forward and laid her $30 on the table in counted bills. The men in that room had known her by name or by sight. A young woman, recently and quietly alone in the world, boarding at the Hessler place on the Ridge Road. She had no father present, no husband, no older brother to lean toward the clerk and ask the clarifying questions a man asks before committing money to ground. She asked none herself. She read the deed description, signed her name, and took her copy of the paper and folded it once and placed it in her coat pocket as though it were a letter she had already answered. It was Court Mabry who looked at Aldous Fenn. The look required no translation. Fenn had sold seed and fencing staples and axle grease to every farmer in the south end of the county for 11 years, and Mabry had broken ground on 3/4 sections in that time, and both of them understood land the way men understand the tools they have used, until the handles are black with their own labor. What she had purchased was not land, it was a liability with a deed attached. Neither man spoke. The room held its breath, and then it let it out, and people reached for their hats and went back to the street, and the filing was done. She did not go to the parcel that same afternoon. She went the next morning, early, before the light had fully committed itself to the day, when the creek bottom lay under a thin ground mist that moved in slow columns between the willow trunks, like breath leaving something not quite dead. She carried nothing but a small ledger, a pencil worn to a stub, and the deed folded in her coat pocket. She did not carry a spade. She had not yet earned the right to a spade. The 12 acres began where the county road dipped, and the gravel gave out, and they ran south and east along the creek's near bank in a shape that no surveyor would call generous. The willows were old enough to have opinions. Their roots had broken through the low bank and reached into the water itself, pale and thick as rope, and where the roots ended, the muck began, and the muck had no discernible bottom that the eye could find. Standing water had pooled in 3 distinct low places, each one reflecting the colorless sky with the flat indifference of something that had been waiting a long time and had grown patient in the waiting. She walked the perimeter first, slowly, the way a person walks when they are reading rather than traveling. She noted in the ledger, in handwriting small and economical, as though the pencil stub had a certain number of words left in it and she did not mean to waste them, that the easternmost pool was the lowest, that the water in it leaned east toward the main channel, but had no exit, no cut, no place to go. She wrote, "Standing east, no outlet." She noted the direction the smartweed grew thickest, which was along the western edge where the bank was highest and the flooding shallowest, and the ground dried first each year. She wrote, "Smartweed west, dries earlier." She knelt at the edge of the muck and pushed one finger into it, not her whole hand, not yet, only her finger, and she withdrew it and looked at it. The soil came up black and dense, and without the pale clay streaks that meant exhaustion. She wrote only, "Black." She smelled sourness. She noted that too. Not the sourness of rot, which is a finished smell, but the sourness of fermentation, of something held in suspension, of water that had been standing still so long it had begun to turn on itself for want of movement. It was the smell of potential that had curdled. She wrote, "Sour, standing." She spent 2 hours on those 12 acres. She did not pull a single stem of smartweed. She did not test the willow roots or sound the bank for drainage angles. She only walked and knelt and looked and wrote, because she understood in some wordless way, learned from what source she could not have named, that the land was telling her something it would not repeat if she moved too quickly, and she meant to hear every word before she answered. The ledger had 6 lines of notes when she left. She had not heard him approach. That was the first thing she registered when she looked up from her final notation and found him standing at the property line, one boot resting on the low fence post she had not yet decided whether to repair or pull. He was an old man, though age had compressed rather than diminished him, wide through the shoulders still, with hands that hung at his sides like something forged rather than grown, and a face that had taken 30 years of Nebraska wind without apology. He was watching her the way a man watches a creek gauge in uncertain weather, not with judgment, but with the patient collection of information. He did not greet her. She did not greet him. He looked at the parcel. He looked at the willow stand along the north bank, then at the place where she had knelt in the smartweed, then at the ledger she held open against her forearm. He looked at all of this the way a man reads a sentence he has read before in a different language, recognizing the shape of it, waiting for the translation to arrive. Then he stepped over the fence post. He walked the near margin of the creek bottom without invitation, without haste, pressing the toe of his boot into the soil at intervals she could not immediately interpret. Not random, she saw, but following some interior map, some geometry of water movement that she did not yet possess. He stopped where the ground went lowest, where the smartweed grew tallest, and the standing water from the last rain had not yet fully retreated, and he stood there for a long moment looking north, then south, then north again. He said, "Water is only sour where it cannot leave." He said it the way a man states a surveyed measurement, not as philosophy, not as comfort, but as a fixed point from which all further calculation must proceed. Then he crouched and picked up a stick from the willow debris at his feet, and he drew in the mud. 2 lines, shallow angled, running from the low center of the parcel toward the creek's eastern edge. Not deep cuts, his stick was not pressed far, but deliberate, the angles considered, the distance between them neither arbitrary nor identical. He drew a 3rd short mark across the mouth of the creek bend. A weir, she understood, a slowing device, something to hold the spring rise long enough to let the lateral drains do their work before the water could build pressure and reverse. He stood. He dropped the stick. She had already opened the ledger to a clean page. She copied the sketch exactly, the 2 drain lines, the angles, the weir mark at the creek mouth, and she noted beside it the direction of the grade as she had walked it that afternoon, cross-referencing the drawing against her own 2 hours of observation. The mud original was already beginning to smooth at the edges as the wet soil settled back into itself. She did not thank him. He did not wait to be thanked. She began the first channel the following morning. The spade she owned was a good one, the handle worn smooth by someone else's years, the blade still holding its edge, and she drove it into the creek bottom at the point where the sketch had marked the upper drain's start. The soil resisted, not with stone, not with hardpan, but with its own wet density, the way saturated ground resists, not by being hard, but by being heavy, by refusing to stay where you put it, by sliding back into the cut before the next stroke falls. She learned this within the first hour. She adjusted. Narrower strokes, lifted clean, set to the side far enough that the spoil would not creep back. She tallied nothing that first morning. There was nothing yet to tally. Pavel came 3 days that first week. He did not dig. His back had long since given him its final terms, but he walked the line she was cutting, read the grade with his boots and his eye, and twice corrected her angle by no more than a hand's width. Once he stopped her entirely and pointed to a place 6 feet south of where she was working, where a seam of clay ran just below the surface and would wall the drain and make it useless. She moved 6 feet south. He walked home. By the end of June, she had opened the first channel to 30 yards. The earth she moved twice. Once to get it out, once to pile it cleanly enough that it would not wash back with the next rain. Her hands had blistered, and the blisters had opened, and then something harder had come in underneath. She recorded the progress in the ledger, in the same spare notation she used for seed costs and weather. June 30th. First channel, 31 yards clear. Grade holds. 2 days lost to rain. The borrowed sled came from a farmer named Mabry, who loaned it without asking what she wanted it for, because the sled was broken and of no use to him that season. She repaired the runner herself with a length of ashboard and 2 iron spikes, and she used it to drag spoil to the parcel's edge in loads, 1 load at a time, the weight of wet muck being not negotiable but absolute. The sled left a groove in the ground over those weeks that remained visible until first frost. The second channel she began in August, shorter, running at the angle Pavel's stick had drawn, joining the first near the creek's edge. This one she cut faster. The first had taught her something about how this soil behaved, where it would hold and where it would slump, how deep to go before the grade began to tell the water which way was out. The weir she and Pavel set in early October, stone by stone, brush packed tight between. By then, the willows along the eastern edge were already dropping leaf. The water did not drain overnight. It did not drain in a week. But it began, in the way that slow things begin, to leave. The winter passed the way winters do on the creek bottoms, not gently, but with a kind of indifference that is almost worse than malice. The ground froze to the depth of 18 inches in January, and the creek ran gray under shelf ice, and nothing moved in the channels she had cut, but cold. She could not see whether the weir held. She could not see whether the brushwork had shifted or the stone face slumped. She could only wait, which is the one labor no tool assists. March came, then the first week of April, which in Gage County is not spring so much as the season's first argument, warm enough to melt, cold enough to freeze again by night, the creek rising on snowmelt from the tableland to the west. She watched the water come into the low end of the parcel on the 8th of April, the same way it had come every year before, spreading flat and brown across the willow roots and pooling in the old depressions. Court Mabry passed the road that week and saw it standing and said nothing, but she read it in the set of his shoulders. What he did not stay to see was what happened next. The channels took the water, not all at once. The weir was holding the creek back to a walking pace, and the 2 cuts were not canals, only invitations. But the standing water on the low end found the grade she had opened and began to move, slowly, deliberately, as a thing will move when it has been shown, for the first time, that there is somewhere to go. By the 19th of April, the water had dropped measurably. By the 1st of May it was gone, not the soil moisture, which remained and which she wanted, but the standing flood, the sour stillness that had kept this ground from amounting to anything in living memory. 11 days from peak to bare ground. The old farmers in the township would have told you to expect 6 weeks, and they would have been right, because they had never seen this ground with its throat opened. She walked out on the 3rd of May with her spade and drove it into the soil beside the first channel and turned a cut of earth, and what came up was black. Not the gray black of waterlogged muck. Black the way good coffee is black, with a sheen to it, the smell of iron and old rain rising off it in the cool morning air. She knelt and pushed her arm into the elbow, not tentatively, but with purpose, testing a hypothesis, and the earth received it and held it and gave back warmth it had been gathering for weeks. She held that pose for a moment without moving. Then she pulled her arm free, wiped the soil on her skirt, and went back to the edge of the parcel where she had set her onion starts in a borrowed flat the evening before, 80 sets, wrapped in burlap against the night, and she began to plant. She planted the 80 sets by hand, on her knees, in rows she had measured with a knotted cord. The ground took them without resistance. That was in early May. By August, she was cutting the tops down and laying the bulbs in windrows to cure, and the onions that came out of that Black Creek soil were not large, not yet, but they were dense, in a way that surprised her when she lifted the first one and turned it in her palm. Solid through, no soft center, no papery give at the neck. She had grown onions before, in better regarded ground, and they had not felt like this. She hauled what she had to market in the borrowed sled in September, a single load, the onions nested in dry grass against bruising. Aldous Fenn was at his usual station behind the weighing counter, and he took the first onion from the crate with the practiced indifference of a man who has handled 10,000 of them, rolling it once between his fingers the way a jeweler rolls a coin to test its edge. He said nothing for a moment. Then he set it on the scale and checked the weight, and set it aside, and picked up a second, and then a third, and the particular quality of his silence changed in some small way that she noted, and filed away. He paid her what the market rate allowed and no more, and he did not compliment her or explain what his hands had told him, but she saw that he did not set the onions with the general pile. He kept them separate and stacked them himself, which was not his habit. She drove home and opened the ledger on the table and wrote the figures in by lamplight. The columns were not long. She had spent, over the course of the season, $14.30 in seed, starts, borrowed equipment, and the iron nails Pavel had advised her to drive into the weir posts to slow the rot. Against that she had taken in $16.80 from Fenn's counter and a smaller sum from two families who had come to her directly, having heard something from someone, she did not know who. $2.50 stood between her and the total she had spent acquiring and working the land. She did not celebrate this, she studied it. $2.50 was not profit in any meaningful sense. It was proof of concept, the thinnest possible margin, a line so fine that a wet week in August or a bad day at market would have erased it entirely. But it had not been erased. It stood in the column, real and dry, the ink holding. She closed the ledger and set it on the shelf above the window where the morning light would find it first. The cellar was still out there, somewhere beneath the north bank, under the willow roots she had not yet finished clearing. She did not know that yet, but the ground was beginning, slowly and without announcement, to show her what it held. The winter had been a teaching one. She had spent it reading the north bank the way a woman reads a letter she is not sure she was meant to receive, slowly, at angles, holding it up to different light. The willows there grew in a line that was almost too orderly for wild growth, their trunks spacing themselves at intervals that suggested something beneath had once organized the surface above. She had noticed this in November, when the leaves were down and the structure of things was visible. She had written nothing about it in the ledger. It was too early to write. It was a question, not yet an answer. By the second week of April 1892, the frost had let go of the upper foot of soil, and she began the clearing in earnest. The second drainage cut needed to run along the north bank's edge, shallower than the first, correcting a low place where water still pooled after the spring rise and refused to move. She worked with the spade and a mattock borrowed from the same neighbor who had lent her the sled 2 years before. The willow roots came up thick and pale, each one requiring the mattock before the spade could follow, and the work was slow in the particular way of work that cannot be hurried without being ruined. She had cleared perhaps 11 feet of the intended line when the spade struck something that did not give. She knew the difference by then. She had struck buried stone before, fieldstone, the kind that frost heaves up in crooked individual pieces, scattered and purposeless. This was not that. The spade rang against the resistance with a flatness, a solidity, that ran on when she moved 6 inches to the left and struck again. She swept the loosened dirt aside with her boot. Then she went to her knees and cleared with her hands. The stone was cut, not field-gathered but shaped, and set with mortar that had gone gray and hard as iron. She could not see where it ended in either direction. She moved 18 inches north along the buried course and cut down again with the spade. The wall was still there, running deeper, running on. She sat back on her heels in the April mud and was still for a moment. Then she began to uncover it properly, one course of stone at a time, the dirt coming away in dark slabs that held the shape of the trowel that had once smoothed mortar into these joints. Whoever had built this had built it with care. The corners were dressed, the mortar had been mixed rich. This was not a farmer laying up a quick wall against a hillside. This was a man who had expected his work to last, who had built as if something worth keeping would be kept here. She did not know yet how deep it ran, nor how wide, nor what lay beyond the point where the willow roots thickened and the soil closed again. She knew only that the ground, which had been answering her slowly for 2 years, had just said something new. She worked north along the wall for the better part of an afternoon before the stone changed direction. It did not end. It turned 90 degrees, dressed at the corner with a flat capstone set flush and level as a courthouse step. She stood in the trench she had opened and looked at the right angle laid out in the mud before her and understood, for the first time, the true shape of what she had found. A wall that turned was not a retaining course. A wall that turned was a room. She cleared the corner and followed the new face east, and within 4 feet, the stonework stepped inward to frame an opening, a doorway, mortared on 3 sides, the lintel, a single dressed slab of limestone resting in its seat, as if it had been placed that morning. The willow roots had grown along the top of it and wrapped the edges, but had not shifted it. Whatever family had quarried that stone and seated it, had quarried it heavy enough that 20 years of root pressure could not move it. The door itself was gone. What remained of the frame held only earth and darkness. She took her lantern from the sled and lit it and went in. The cellar ran 40 feet from the lintel to its back wall. She paced it twice to be certain. The floor was earthen and dry, genuinely dry, not merely damp, and the walls rose to a height of 6 feet on both sides, the mortar joints as tight and clean as the day they had been pointed. The earthen roof had been cut into the creek bank and packed with clay, and above the clay, she knew, the willows grew in a dense, unbroken canopy. For nearly 2 decades those willows had been doing what willows do, drinking the moisture that might have softened the ceiling, shading the roof from the sun that might have cracked it open. The very flooding that soured the soil each spring had been maintaining, year by year, a stable cold humidity inside these walls, the same steady cold that a good cellar demands and that a man must work years to achieve in open ground. Whoever had built this had understood the creek. They had set the cellar into the north bank deliberately, at an elevation just above the flood line, where the chill of the water table never left the stone, but the water itself could not enter. They had built, and then the grasshoppers had come, in 1874 and again in 1875, and the family had gone, as so many families had gone in those years, and the willows had closed over the entrance, and the county had forgotten the land entirely, and eventually sold it for $30 to a woman nobody believed. The lantern threw its light against the far wall. She held it up and looked at the length of the room and did not yet speak. She did not speak because there was nothing yet to say. What she felt in that first minute was not triumph but something closer to the attention a surveyor gives to a new parcel, a focused, almost impersonal reckoning. She had learned, in 2 seasons of working ground that answered slowly, to withhold judgment until she had numbers. She set the lantern on the packed earth floor and began at the entrance wall. She had no measuring rod, but she had paced enough field rows to trust her stride. She walked the length once, counting aloud in the low dark, and walked it again to confirm. 40 feet, both times, with a foot or less of variance she attributed to her own uneven step on the soft floor. She spread her arms to either side and found she could not touch both walls. 12 feet, perhaps a hand's width more. She pressed her palm flat against the mortar between the stones and felt no seep, no cold bloom of moisture. The walls were dry. She knelt and pressed her palm to the floor and raised a faint ghost of dust, a thing she had not seen from the soil outside in 2 years of working it. She stood and held the lantern high and turned a slow circle. She returned to the ledger the following morning and opened it to a fresh page and wrote what she had observed in the same spare columns she had used to record the drainage work. Measurements first, then material and condition, then a note on temperature. She had brought a small glass thermometer, purchased the previous autumn from the dry goods counter, and she carried it down into the cellar and waited, and it settled between 50 and 52 degrees. She came back at midday, when the August sun was direct overhead, and read it again. 53. She recorded both figures and wrote the date beside them. She sat a long time with the ledger open across her knees, looking at the column of numbers as if they were a sentence that had not yet finished forming. The drainage had made the land farmable. The muck had made the farming exceptional. But these two things together, the black soil above and the cold, dry stone below, were something her arithmetic had not anticipated. 40 feet of controlled temperature, packed earth floor dry enough to hold cured onion without rot, stone walls that would not sweat through an Indian summer or crack in a hard freeze. She thought of her onion rows. She thought of cabbage heads pulled in October and the way they softened and stank by December if they had nowhere proper to go. She thought of her neighbors' harvests, which had nowhere to go at all. She turned to a clean line in the ledger and wrote one word: storage. Then she drew the pen beneath it twice, slowly, and looked at what she had written. She did not wait for the idea to ripen further. Within a fortnight of writing that single word in the ledger, she had measured the cellar a second time, pacing its length, counting the courses of stone up each wall, estimating how many bushels of cured onion could stand in slatted crates along the east side and still leave a working passage down the center. The numbers came back generous, more generous than her own harvest could fill. The second harvest that autumn was not modest. It was extraordinary in the way that land will be, sometimes, when it has been asked the right question after a long silence. The onions came out of the black muck like small fists, dense, dry-skinned, smelling of iron and sweetness together. The cabbages were head-tight, their outer leaves pale as limestone in the October light. The late potatoes cured firm and sound, and she carried them down the stone stairs and set them on the packed earth floor in rows, and the cellar received them without complaint. When her own produce was in, there was still room enough. She began with one family, the Dreschers, who had no cellar at all and had lost half their cabbage to a warm November the year before. She offered them 12 linear feet of wall space for 20 cents a month. The transaction took less than an hour to arrange and was recorded in the ledger that same evening. Then the Holubars, then the Renners, a widow named Greer on the South Road who had more potatoes than her dugout could safely hold. By December, she was storing for 5 families. By February, 7. Among them, before that winter was out, was Court Mabry, who in the spring of 1890 had stood at the tax sale table and told the men around him that the girl had bought herself a good crop of mud. He came on a gray afternoon with a sled of cabbages behind a horse, and his hat pulled low against the wind, and he said nothing about what year it was or what he had said then, and she said nothing either. She opened the cellar, showed him where his crates would go, told him the fee, and wrote his name in the column. The ledger now showed real arithmetic, not the arithmetic of hope, that narrow, provisional column she had kept through the first 2 seasons, where every figure was a wager against the weather. This was different. This was recurring, predictable. 7 families, a monthly fee, her own harvest cured, and waiting below the frost line while the Dakota wind moved over the 12 acres and found nothing to take. She turned to a fresh page in February and drew 2 columns: income, remaining capacity. The second column was not yet empty. The second column did not stay empty long. By the following September, the September of 1893, the cellar held the harvests of 11 families, stacked in their crates and burlap sacks along walls that had been cut and mortared by hands, long buried in this same earth. Her own onions ran the full length of the eastern shelf, each one cured to a tight, papery skin, each one larger than anything the township had seen come out of creek-bottom ground. The cabbages were head-tight and pale as winter moons. The late potatoes were dry and firm, stored in the cool dark exactly as the German family before her had once intended, in a cellar they had built with the same conviction she carried now, that the ground, if read correctly, would answer. He came in the second week of that month. He came with his county ledger under one arm, and a lantern he had lit before he reached the bottom step, though the afternoon was not yet gone. He was not a young man. He had written the word unimprovable in an official hand on an official page, and he had believed it, and he had not been wrong by any measure available to him at the time. He descended the stairs one step at a time and held the lantern out before him, and he was quiet. There are things that cannot be disputed with words, because words are not the right instrument. The walls answered him in bushels. The floors answered him in weight. The smell of good cured allium and cold earth and mortared stone answered him in the language of a full account. He turned the lantern slowly and looked at the full length of the eastern shelf, and he looked at the sacks ranked along the floor, and he looked at the clean, dry walls that had stood undisturbed through every flood this creek had ever run. He opened his ledger. He revised the figure. He did it without speaking. She stood at the foot of the stairs and let him work. When he was finished, she walked to the shelf where her own ledger rested, above the row of cured onions, and she opened it to the last active page. She wrote the new assessed value in the right-hand column. Beside it, in the column she had kept since the beginning, the original figure remained, $30, a tax sale price, a number that had made men laugh at a table on a spring morning 3 years before. She did not say anything about that morning. She did not need to. The ledger said it. She closed the book and set it back on the shelf above the onions, in the dark and the cool, where the land's full account could rest beside the harvest it had taken 3 years, and a spade, and an old man's patient instruction to bring out of the ground. The cellar held it all. The door, when she drew it shut, made no